Hello and welcome back to Indus News with me, Osman Lone. Well, we begin this hour with our top story, and that's Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan saying the freedom movement in occupied Kashmir will gain momentum after India lifts its curfew. He called upon the international community to show moral courage in preventing the genocide of Kashmiris. Khan went on to say that the Indian government thinks it will suppress Kashmiris by deploying greater military force. The remarks come after India illegally stripped the occupied valley of its special status after scrapping Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. Now, Pakistan says it has reason to believe that India will stage a false flag operation in the region of occupied Kashmir. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says Pakistan will take India's revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status to the UN Security Council. He also briefed foreign diplomats on the recent developments in occupied Kashmir. More in this report.
Pakistan is swiftly increasing diplomatic pressure on India for revoking the special status of occupied Kashmir. Addressing a press conference, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said he has informed EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini of Pakistan's stance on Kashmir. He rejected New Delhi's claims that scrapping Article 370 of the Indian Constitution is an internal matter.
Their impression that it is an internal matter is not correct. Occupied Kashmir is recognized as disputed territory by the UN. The UN Security Council has several resolutions on the matter. We have made them the foundation of our decision to take the issue to the UNSC.
Foreign Minister Qureshi warned India against selling a false narrative on occupied Kashmir. He said India has converted occupied Kashmir into a prison and is deploying additional troops. Qureshi went on to say that Pakistan is looking at political, diplomatic and legal ways of resolving the Kashmir dispute.
Prime Minister Imran Khan is looking at political, legal and diplomatic options. We are not looking at any military options.
He said Pakistan stands by its commitment on the Kartarpur corridor for Sikh pilgrims despite the flaring tensions over Kashmir.
Now, New Delhi's communications blackout and security clampdown in occupied Kashmir have been challenged in the Indian Supreme Court. An activist of the opposition Congress has filed a petition in the country's top court as India's lockdown enters its fourth day. Life in the valley has been paralyzed for the local community as a ban on all communication channels, including landlines, mobile networks and the internet, has taken place. Over 800,000 Indian troops have arrested more than 500 Kashmiris over the past 4 days. There's also reports of multiple martyrdoms as occupying troops snub protests rejecting India's illegal accession of the valley. China have also stepped in the row over Kashmir, and Chinese Ambassador Yao Ying has said Beijing opposes India's unilateral change in the status of occupied Kashmir. He was talking to the media in Islamabad, and Ying said New Delhi must respect UN resolutions and international norms concerning Kashmir. The Chinese envoy hoped Pakistan and India will act responsibly for the sake of peace and the people of Kashmir. The statement comes after India illegally stripped the occupied valley of its special status after scrapping Article 370. Now, Indian troops have turned occupied Kashmir into a prison. People are under house arrest, and suspension of internet and telephone services have cut them off from the outside world. More in this report.
The security lockdown in Kashmir ended its fourth day on Thursday. In Srinagar, life is at a standstill as people are confined to their homes and roads are blocked. There's no way in or out.
There is no person in sight on the roads. It doesn't look like a curfew. People are imprisoned in their own homes. I feel like the situation in Kashmir will get worse, and this will continue for the next 4 or 5 months. Kashmir seems like it's on the verge of burning. I feel like whatever the government has done for us is not right for us.
The people of Kashmir fear the situation is going to get worse.
No, the newspapers do not reach everybody, but it reaches some people in the city. It has become very difficult for people to travel. We are managing a bit with the food as it is difficult. Day by day, the situation is getting worse. The situation is very bad here. A curfew is being imposed. Our work has been disrupted. There is no work in progress.
Local people see Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's decision to withdraw Occupied Kashmir's special status as a breach of trust, and now they are left wondering whether they belong to India or Kashmir.
Now to other news, and in Afghanistan, the Taliban have said the United States attacks on civilians have raised a cloud of doubt about an expected troops withdrawal deal. Taliban leader Mullah Habibullah Akhundzada said increased US bombings is disrupting the ongoing peace process. Akhundzada said trust is the foundation of a successful negotiation process and it is important such actions end. The Taliban went on to say that Wednesday's bomb in Kabul was a response to daily attacks by government forces. As the war continues in Syria, 25 fighters have been killed as government forces advance further into rebel-held territory. War monitors of the Syrian Observatory say the government has captured 2 more villages in northwest Hama province. They said 7 government soldiers and 18 rebels were killed in fierce clashes in the region. The observatory said the government forces and their Russian allies targeted Hama and neighboring Idlib with airstrikes. And staying with Syria, the Syrian government has said that the US-Turkey deal over North East Syria is a blatant attack on the country's sovereignty. Damascus says the American-Turkish partnership to manage northern Syria is a dangerous escalation in the region. Now, this comes a day after Washington and Ankara agreed to set up a joint operations center in Turkey for a planned safe zone in Syria. Turkey and the United States were deadlocked for months over the scope and command of the safe zone. Earlier, Washington and Ankara had agreed to set up a joint operations center in Turkey to manage a planned safe zone in northern Syria. After 3 days of talks in Ankara, the 2 countries said the safe zone will be a peace corridor. The agreement was announced by Turkey's defense minister and the US embassy in Ankara. 3 people have been killed and 10 injured in Yemen during clashes between Presidential Guard forces and UAE-backed separatists in the city of Aden. The violence highlights a rift within the Saudi-UAE-led coalition battling the Houthi rebel movement since 2015. The coalition and the government of President Abdul Mansur Hadi are united against the Houthis, but have rival agendas for Yemen's future. The United Nations has called for a de-escalation after a surge in violence in the port city. Meanwhile, discussing regions changes in the Middle East, US Secretary Mike Pompeo thanked Saudi Arabia for its support in Yemen. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has discussed maritime security and Iran with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The US State Department says both discussed stronger maritime security for the freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. The statement also said Iran's destabilizing activities were discussed among other bilateral and regional issues. This comes amid heightened tensions in the Persian Gulf over the 2015 nuclear deal and oil tanker seizures by Iran and Britain. Now, the United States says it will keep Sudan on its list of countries that sponsor terrorism. The US Undersecretary for Political Affairs, David Hale, visited Khartoum and met with the military and civilian leadership. Hale says the US needs to resolve long-standing issues with the country before it can consider removing it from the list. Hale pledged Washington's commitment to peace and security in the country.
The fact is that Sudan remains designated as a state sponsor. That remains in effect. There are a number of things we're looking forward to engaging in a civilian-led government. The issues that before us include the promotion of human rights and religious freedom, counterterrorism efforts.
US immigration officials have arrested 680 undocumented migrant workers in the southern state of Mississippi. Meat processing plants were targeted in the largest workplace sting in a decade. Meanwhile, the US's top diplomat for Latin America, Kimberly Breyer, resigned amid internal disputes over immigration policies in the country. About 600 US immigration and customs enforcement agents, also known as ICE agents, fanned out across plants operated by 5 companies. ICE officials say the raids were planned months ago. They say employees could be charged with knowingly hiring illegal citizens and scrutinized for tax, document and wage fraud. The raids came just hours before Trump's visit to El Paso, Texas, a Latino-majority border city where 22 people were killed over the weekend. Amnesty International has issued a travel warning for visitors to the United States. This comes after a weekend of mass shootings in the country that left 31 people dead. Amnesty warned travelers the United States does not adequately protect people's right to be safe, regardless of who they might be. It said gun violence has become so prevalent in the United States, it amounts to a human rights crisis. The global human rights movement says people in the US cannot reasonably expect to be free from harm. The movement says it is impossible to guarantee not being shot in any part of the United States. Beijing has denounced the ban slapped by the US technology giant Huawei and other Chinese firms as abuse of state power. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying says the curbs undermine the image and interests of the United States. The spokeswoman says Beijing supports the Chinese companies in taking up legal means to safeguard their rights and interests. The statement comes amid rising trade tensions between the world's top two economies. Rules unveiled by the US ban Chinese firms from government contracts. The US has raised a travel warning for Hong Kong, urging visitors to exercise caution. Hong Kong has been rocked by months of protests that began in response to a now suspended extradition law to China. The protests have evolved into a direct challenge to the government amid calls for full democracy. The US Consulate General Hong Kong Advisory says demonstrations have spilled over into banned areas. More protests are planned across the city this weekend. Australia has also warned its travellers against visiting the territory in an updated advisory. Earlier, Beijing criticised the US and UK for getting involved in its domestic affairs. The Venezuelan government has abandoned talks with the opposition in protest against fresh US sanctions. The Information Ministry says President Nicolas Maduro has ordered his officials not to travel to Barbados for talks starting today. The ministry says the decision was made due to the grave and brutal aggression being continuously carried out by Washington. It says opposition leader Juan Guaido celebrated and promoted actions harmful to national sovereignty. Now, this comes after President Donald Trump seized all Venezuelan government assets in the United States. Washington also threatened it would impose sanctions on any American doing business with Venezuela. Now in Asia, 16 people have been killed in torrential rains and flooding in India's west-central Maharashtra state. State officials say over 100,000 people have been affected by floods and they've now been evacuated. Officials also say dams in the region are overflowing as the rains continue. This comes as the monsoon wreaks havoc across India, killing around 500 people since the start of July. Now, stop eating too much meat if you want to help the climate. This was a message by the United Nations in a report on climate change and land. It warned that efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions will fall short if changes in agriculture and people's food habits are not met. More in this report.
The special report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change analysed the impact of existing food systems on the planet. It found that agriculture is responsible for 37% of all man-made emissions.
We humans affect more than 70% of ice-free land. A quarter of this land is degraded. The way we produce food and what we eat contributes to the loss of natural ecosystems and declining biodiversity. When land is degraded, it reduces the soil's ability to take up carbon, and this exacerbates climate change.
The report states industrial farmland covers a third of all land today. Dietary changes, including consumption of more plant-based food, could free up several million square kilometers.
The science is clear. The land system interacts with climate in a very dramatic way. And to be able to protect climate and limit warming to 1.5 degrees and be able to restore forests and other natural ecosystems, we need to radically change our food system. That includes reducing dramatically the amount of meat and dairy in our farms and in our diet.
The report warns that any delay in implementing its recommended changes will have devastating consequences. At the report's launch, the IPCC co-chair Ho Sung Lee said land is part of the solution, but land cannot do it all.
Now, a drought in Zimbabwe has left over 2 million Zimbabweans on the verge of starvation. That's according to the UNWFP. And now Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa has declared the drought in the southern African country a national disaster. The UN Food Agency has launched a $300 million appeal to help Zimbabwe recover from the drought. Executive Director of the WFP, David Beasley, says the number of people that are suffering will increase to 5.5 million by March next year. He was speaking at a joint appeal with the Zimbabwe government in Harare. Beasley said the country needs food aid urgently. Now, from a small London workshop, Bellaby & Co. turns out hundreds of high-quality handmade luxury globes each year. And it all started when Peter Bellaby himself was looking for one to gift his father and inadvertently catapulted himself into a new profession. More in this report.
In 2008, Peter Bellaby set out to buy his father a high-quality handmade globe on his 80th birthday. When he could not find one, the Briton decided to make it himself.
From start to finish, if it can be done by hand, it will be. We don't unnecessarily use a machine. Obviously, we have to have printers, we have to have woodworking tools, but everything in the making of the globe that we can do by hand is done by hand.
Just over a decade later, his company Bellaby & Co. claims to be the finest globe maker in the world. Their buyers include heads of state and big companies, as well as everyday people wanting to mark a special occasion. The entire process can take anywhere from just weeks to as long as 18 months, depending on the size.
The hard bit about the job is to make all the panels look the same, because we paint them individually first with washes. So it's like if you're painting 24 canvases and they all have to look the same when you put them together.
Bellaby has learned that mapping can present a minefield of political grievances and sensitivities and worse. Indian customs officials temporarily impounded one globe over how their country's border with Pakistan was depicted. They also must keep abreast of countries changing their names, such as Swaziland becoming Eswatini last year.
The globe is always the same, but it's like reading a book or watching a film over and over, and you always notice different details. I will be painting and then I notice something that I didn't notice before, so either a lake or an island or a river, and sometimes I just go on Google Image and see what the place looks like, and many times I'm like, I really want to go there. So I guess my travel wish list is longer than most people's.
Now the business turns out around 600 globes annually, some destined to sit in grand mansions and aboard yachts. They range in size and price, with the smallest starting at £1,200 and the biggest costing around £79,000.
Now, Paris, the city of love, home to the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe and the Louvre, and it attracts millions of tourists every single year. But it's also attracting a growing number of seagulls, and they're jostling with pigeons for a perch on the city's rooftops. More in this report.
Parisians need no longer go to the beach in the time-honored August tradition to hear the plaintive cries of seagulls. The birds' growing cacophony is ruffling many feathers in the French capital. Among the spots where the gulls tend to congregate are the environs of the fire-damaged Notre Dame Cathedral. They also include an island in the middle of the Seine, as well as the old Jewish quarter of Les Marais.
Unlike the gulls found on the coast, which are finding it increasingly difficult to find food, which are increasingly disturbed by leisure and other activities, Parisian gulls nest on rooftops at high altitudes and are quite there since they have no predators. Basically, the only predators they could fear are cats and foxes, but they rarely go that high.
Parisian gulls have risen to between 50 and 60 breeding pairs that produce 3 chicks a year. Ecosystems are increasingly upset by terrorism and construction along the coastal line, forcing the migration of birds.
It's true that when you're sleeping and you're woken up by, but that's the way it is.
The cacophony, according to Parisians, is much nicer than all the noise pollution on the streets.
Dozens of hot air balloons took to the skies in the English city of Bristol as the city's annual balloon festival began. The Bristol International Balloon Fiesta is the biggest ballooning event in Europe. The event will continue for the next 4 days, and more than 130 hot air balloons from across the world are taking part in the event. Now let's take a look at some of the news in the world of business. And European and Asian stock markets are up across the board after better than expected Chinese export numbers for July. Investors were also encouraged by the Chinese central bank's moves to limit the fall of the yuan. The CAC index in Paris increased by 1%, with Frankfurt's DAX not far behind. London's FTSE 100 is also fractionally higher. Earlier, the Shanghai Composite closed nearly 1% up after China reported dollar-denominated exports rose by over 3% year-on-year in July. Japan's Nikkei 225 and the Hang Seng in Hong Kong and Australia's ASX 200 all gained ground. The Kospi rose 0.5% after Japan approved the export of goods affected by its withdrawal of South Korea's preferential trade status. China has reported better than expected rise in exports despite mounting economic pressure from elevated US tariffs. China's customs data shows exports have risen 3.3% in July. Imports have fallen about 5.5% during the same period. The country's overall trade surplus last month was about $45 billion. Meanwhile, from January to July, China's trade surplus with the United States totaled over $168 billion. Pakistan and Afghanistan have agreed to boost trade by opening a preferential trade agreement. This comes after a meeting between Prime Minister's Commerce Advisor Abdul Razak and Afghan envoy to Pakistan, Shukurullah Mashal. Razak says both sides will share their initial list of tariff lines next month, followed by technical committee meetings. The two sides discussed reopening border crossing points, including Torkham and Ghulam Khan. The ministry says the PM's advisor will visit Kabul this month to finalize the understanding on different trade and economic issues. Now, Britain's new Prime Minister Boris Johnson has sent Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab to Washington to fast-track a post-Brexit trade deal with the United States. He said Britain wants to reach a free trade deal with the US. In a press talk with US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Foreign Secretary Raab said Britain will manage the post-Brexit risks. Earlier in a meeting with US President Donald Trump, Dominic Raab said the UK looks forward to working with its American friends. Last year, the United States ran a $20 billion trade surplus with Britain, making UK America's 5th largest export market. Now, in the world of sports, Brazil striker Gabriel Jesus has been hit with a 2-month international ban. The ban comes amid following his actions after receiving a red card in the final of the Copa America Cup. Gabriel Jesus kicked a water bottle and pushed a VAR monitor after being sent off for getting a second yellow card. The governing body of South American football has also fined him $30,000. The ban will see the Manchester City forward miss up to 4 international matches, including friendlies against Colombia and Peru in September. Now it's 31 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all the news for now, and so from me and the team in Lahore, bye-bye.